2. If you want to go ahead and open your Bibles here, James chapter 2. We spent a fair bit of time talking about some of the kind of surrounding issues as relates to partiality. Sometimes where we might be tempted with it. We've talked about James's reasoning as relates to the specific form of partiality. So before we remind ourselves of this text with a reading of it, what is the partiality under discussion here in James chapter 2? Yeah, of class distinction, financial partiality, where preference is given to those who are rich and where those who are poor are despised. That, as we've seen in our study a couple weeks ago, doesn't make a lot of sense, right? For a number of reasons. What are some of the reasons why that kind of partiality doesn't make sense? Yeah, Jesus was poor, and as relates to those who were, probably the majority of his disciples, they also were poor. So there's a glaring contradiction between the prosperity gospel and the focus of the gospel, right? The idea that following God is a pathway to wealth is a glaring contrast to Jesus, who became poor for our sakes and who lived in poverty. But what else? What are other contrasts?
The rich are the ones that oppress the poor.
Yeah, the rich that are the ones that are so often oppressive, not only of the poor, but of all. Those who have wealth, if left unchecked, they will, like when we think about the problem that we have in our culture is that we have so many things that have been influenced by Christianity without us realizing it. There really isn't, when you remove Christianity from the picture, there really isn't any inherent ethic or morals in wealth. And in fact, we can just go back a couple of hundred years to where the Christian principles, though they seem to be more present in culture, were more absent in certain aspects of culture. Like when you think about what it was like to be an industrial worker in the late 1800s. There were some people who were extremely wealthy in those situations, but what was the condition of the people living in those shops and factories, and what were they subjected to? You can't even imagine. And still, there are things have gotten maybe a little bit better globally in that way, but there are still places that are where people are really, really being oppressed by people who have a whole lot more than they do, and subjected to really terrible situations. You can Google sometime the village in China that makes Christmas. It's really depressing, actually. But there is a village in China that their year-round job is to make Christmas. And like these like decorations that like when you see things that are like twisted up, that's not done by a machine. That's somebody who's hand twisting day after day, year after year, all of these little trinkets that we hang on our trees. And so we don't think about all these things so often, but James is actually calling us to reflect upon them as we give value judgment, to say, hey, this isn't good, and it's not something that we should allow to affect the way we view things. Instead, we should view things for what they are. All right, with that reminder, let's read the first 13 verses of chapter 2. Get ourselves back into the swing of things, because we're going to very quickly, try to think about, we've kind of diagnosed the problem. What are our solutions? And then what is our motivation as the text concludes? So let's read verses 1 through 13.
My brethren, do not hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with partiality. For if there should come into your assembly a man with gold rings in fine apparel, and there should also come in a poor man with filthy clothes, and you pay attention to the one wearing the fine clothes, and you say to him, you sit here in a good place, and you say to the poor man, you stand there or sit here at my footstool. Have you not shown partiality among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brethren, has God not chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Do not the rich oppress you and drag you into the courts? Do they not blaspheme that noble name by which you are called? If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you do well. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment.
Okay, so we won't and greatly belabor this point as it's a continuation of a discussion we've already had. But James does encourage common sense thinking about the wealthy in verses 6 and 7. Aren't these the ones who oppress you? Aren't they the ones who drag you into courts? Don't they blaspheme your holy name? We perceive that wealth will just inherently be distributed. That's kind of the cornerstone teaching of capitalism. But really, if Christianity weren't influencing our structures to some degree, that would happen a whole lot less than it does. So it's not actually the case. You go back, to the world of Paul and the world of so many people throughout the ages, and this is the situation that so often is the case, that those who have wealth are using it to further oppress those who don't. And so in many cases, the rich actively oppress the poor. But we remind ourselves, of course, that there are some who are rich amongst those who are saved, and we don't want to just make a class judgment the other way. We've talked about that a little bit. Though there are few who are wealthy who are called, it doesn't mean that there are none. All right. So with that little reminder, let's kind of step forward in our study to some other issues here, or some other thoughts that James is giving. So James believes the royal law to be applicable in this situation in verse number 8. If you fulfill the royal law according to the scriptures, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So we might have thought previously, if we were readers of the gospel accounts to this text, we might have thought previously that the second great command is this, statement. But here another way of describing it, the royal law. And I think that's just meant to highlight its importance and its significance. But what does it mean? What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? And what does that demand?
First,
it demands prioritization. We have a little song we sing sometimes with the kids, JOY. Does anybody know what that means? Do we need to sing the song? Jesus first, yourself last, and others in between, right? So there's a prioritization that ought to be made as we're following the royal law. And that royal law, of course, again, is the second great command. The first command is to love God preeminently. And so that's why Jesus comes first. But Jesus would have us putting others ahead of ourselves, right? Were you going to say something? Would you like to contribute? You don't have to. I saw you whispering something, so no, I wouldn't mean to put you on the spot. What's that?
You said judgment.
Judgment, yeah. No judgment. So, to love is in some way to be treated to treat others as you desire to be treated. And we can think about this law of love as relates to the golden rule of Matthew chapter 7. And we don't desire for others to put limitations upon us in their view of us, which is what effectively a judgment often does. Or so again, not to apply that to others. What else?
Well, as needs come up, you don't just brush them off and say, well, that's their problem. That's their responsibility, and I'm not going to have any part in that. As a body, and as this verse talks about, just with our neighbors in general, with people that we encounter in life, as we hear their needs and listen to their needs, I think there should be some sort of weight of how we thinking about how we can maybe put aside our wants to help them.
Yeah.
Because their needs are, if we are to love them as ourselves, then their needs are to be as important to us as they are to them.
Yeah. So to value what other people value and to put their needs ahead of our own. And that stems us into, actually thinking about this text in its context, right? So the question is, why does James bring this up here? Why is James talking about loving your neighbor in connection with our temptation to be prejudicial or judgmental? And I think that's kind of the idea, because why would you, if a rich man came into the assembly, why would you treat him better? And why would you treat the poor person worse? What would be the motivation behind that? Yeah, because there's a perception that the rich man can give you something, whereas the poor person can't give you anything. And so where does that judgment in some way arise from? It arises from a desire to seek your own interest, to seek your own good. And so we have a natural tendency to seek our own interest and to seek our own good. And the royal law calls us to say, okay, all right, that's there. All right, we can't get rid of that, loving ourselves, but love your neighbor in that way. And so if you want your own good to be promoted, want their good to be promoted. And so stop thinking in terms of what is going to be the outcome for you, or how are you going to be benefited from something. Start thinking in terms of how are they going to be benefited, or how can I benefit them? And so really, what the rich so often need, instead of our admiration and respect, is a reality check that they are far from the kingdom of God, and that it's easier for a camel to enter into the eye of a needle than for them to attain true spiritual wealth. So they need a reality check more than anything else, and putting them on a pedestal is not likely to give it to them. Whereas the person who's poor, likely they're going to need some assistance to be able to set aside their poverty, which consumes their idea of need so often. And let's see if we can't set that aside so that they can see their spiritual need, so that they can see what the real problems are. Felt needs are always more powerful than the unfelt needs, although the unfelt needs are the ones that are more important. If you're hungry, that seems to be more important than hungering and thirsting after righteousness, right? But that's what we have to do, and so that requires us to treat them in a different way. It's not a prejudicial kind of treatment, but it's thinking about, well, what's going to advance their cause, what's going to be best for them. So, any other thoughts about the royal law in verse number 8, and James bringing that up here?
The key is the word as. Love your neighbor as yourself. Mm-hmm. So that puts a perspective on it. How would we take care of ourselves? And we see in Ephesians 5, even so ought husbands also to love their own wives as their own bodies. So how would I take care of myself?
Yeah.
I need to treat my mate that way. Love your neighbor as yourself. That puts the light of how this should look.
Yeah.
How do we take care of ourselves? Are we doing that?
Yeah. It's a tool of examination, isn't it? I mean, what am I giving to myself in terms of what I have and what I have to give? Is there any comparison? So often, our lives can be consumed with our own pursuits. And, James is saying, Jesus is saying, and all the Bible is saying when he gives us this command, let's think about this a little bit. Let's think about what we are giving to ourselves, and actually allow there to be some kind of correlation to what we are giving to others. Yeah. Becca?
I always think about hospitality in the church, but Ashley always tells her girls to, these are our guests, we're giving them the best. And I think that is a really beautiful kind of picture of this.
Yeah.
Just kind of practically.
Yeah. So giving a guest the best. Picture what might happen at a meal, but then a perspective, right? So that's really good. Thanks for bringing that to our attention. Anything else? All right. So why is this command the solution to economic prejudice? I think we talked about that a little bit. I kind of got ahead of myself. So verse 9, a really blunt appraisal is kind of needed here. And so verse number 9, to kind of bring all this home, there's practical reasons not to show this kind of favoritism There's some things that need to be thought about in terms of the typical trappings of wealth and the way the wealthy in Paul's world conducted themselves. But then here's the bottom line, spiritually speaking, verse 9, if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. And so it's sinful to be partial, and it brings one under condemnation. So with that kind of as our bottom line, we can have all kinds of reasons why we shouldn't do this, but here's the bottom line. It's going to cause our soul to be separated from God forever. So knowing that, how can we fight the tendency towards favoritism and partiality within us? What are some practical steps to doing that?
With ourselves and like what we either value or devalue within ourselves.
Okay.
Because we're to love others as we love ourselves. And I think if we are, I wish I wasn't like this, I wish I wasn't like that, and you like put on a pedestal the people who maybe have the things you wish you had or whatever. That putting the first things first in your life and what you value in yourself, and then that can trickle on to how you treat others.
So it maybe starts, Chantel, saying with a sort of value evaluation. What do I value? How do I view myself? It's interesting. I can't help but think about when I read, loving your neighbor as yourself, the reality of 21st century life. We are incredibly financially blessed, incredibly physically blessed, but how does that correlate to happiness? How does that correlate to depression? What would you say about that? It doesn't. And in fact, I know that like 150 years ago, they didn't have the luxury of taking statistics on depression, right? But it really seems that as we are more blessed, we are more dissatisfied. And so I think that we actually have bought into the devil's lie about our own evaluation of ourselves. And so there's this kind of weird other kind of thing that happens in terms of the way that we show prejudice. We actually devalue ourselves. We put others up on pedestals. And because of that, we're already not viewing things properly. So there's this effect that is being tracked in, like through social media, this perception that people have of everybody else having a better experience than they do, because all that they are seeing is the high points of everyone's life. I mean, people don't share oftentimes the mundane on social media and that kind of thing. They share the best things that they're doing, the most prettiest things that they've seen, and all these things. Everybody else has a better experience than me. And so when you start viewing the world as that, you're not valuing yourself properly, and you'll never be able to then go on to contribute anything to anyone, help them in any meaningful way, because you'll already see them as being ahead of you in some way. So maybe there has to be some thought given to how I view myself and my privileges, how I view myself in terms of what God has given me, and how I view myself in terms of my place in Christ, the value inherent in being in Christ. I think it is incredibly important. I've tried to drive this home on several occasions, and I'll keep doing it. It's incredibly important to be a people of gratitude, because I think that failing to show gratitude to God and failing to actually think about the good things in your life is so strongly connected to departing from God, so strongly connected to living in and ultimately a very selfish way. Because if you're focused and consumed by I don't have and I'm not, and that's one, very depressive, but it's also two, incredibly selfish. And it's really the way the devil wants us to live. He wants us to live in this kind of mindset where we don't have, others do. We don't get to do, others get to do. And we're dissatisfied with that. We're trying to pursue whatever we possibly can to try to meet up with them. And all of that is just another form of covetousness. All of that is a form of self-idolatry. And all of that will separate us from God.
Verse 30 speaks to that mindset. It says, give me neither poverty nor riches, feed me with the food that is my portion, lest I be full and deny thee, and say, who is the Lord, or lest I be in want and steal and profane the name. So there's that middle ground where there's a balance there between the two, where we do appreciate what we have.
Yeah.
But we're not going to either extreme.
Well, Hagar's prayer there, which if you didn't hear, Mike, give me neither poverty nor riches, isn't just appreciating what you have, it's appreciating what you don't have. Being thankful that you don't have more than you need because of what that would create in you. You know, I mean, how often do you pause and give thanks for what you don't have? That's not the way we're wired by our world, right? I think that we've been shaped by a world, you know, like if you consume any kind of media, the goal of every kind of media, the funding that creates all these forms of media is advertisement, and advertisement has one message. Yeah, buy. Well, here's the message that the motivation for buying. Your life isn't good, but it would be if, you know, like if you had this thing, if you had this product, if you had this experience, then your life would be good. But then we get those things and then our life hasn't really gotten that much better. Oh, there must be something else that we need. There must be something else that would make it better. And that whole mindset, like I said, runs totally contrary to the first step in loving our neighbor, because it's assumed that we're going to love ourselves, right? It's assumed that we're going to have a proper evaluation of self. And so Satan is trying to get rid of that idea and create dissatisfaction, a lack of contentment, covetousness driving us, and then we can't love our neighbor. Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
A way to avoid your tendency towards partiality. It's difficult for some people, but just put yourself on somebody else's level and talk to them.
Yeah.
As though you are just like them, as you have the same problems they do, because we all have the same sort of problems. We have money problems, medical problems, children problems, relationship problems. But actually speak to them with some compassion.
Yeah.
And just by talking to them, you're recognizing that they have value. And listening to them, they have value.
Yeah.
And it's like sitting in the back of the bus. Go sit in the back of the bus with whoever thinks they have to sit back there. Be one of them. You will not feel like you are different when you start to understand and walk in somebody else's shoes.
Yeah.
It's hard to be partial when you're actually walking in their shoes.
Yeah. So the best way to understand where people are at is just to listen. We so often assume we know what we don't, and there are any number of things that lead us to judgment. So maybe what we need, instead of drawing conclusions, is to get more information. So listen, ask questions, seek people's experiences, learn what those are, and that will help you to figure out what kind of love they need. Yeah. Other thoughts? Appreciate the reflections we've had. So what does it mean to be guilty of partiality? I feel like we kind of have talked a lot about that. So I kind of write these questions and then feel like we might have given the answer. Anybody have any other thoughts about verse 9 before we move forward? All right. So James wants to stigmatize our tendency to stigmatize people. You know, he wants to really help us to see how bad this is. Calling it something sin doesn't always have the effect that it should. It should be that if we learn something as sin, we're like, wow, that's bad. I don't want to have that in my life at all. But unfortunately, we still like to rank things and, oh, that's bad, but that's really bad, and so we do that with sin, unfortunately. But James then, kind of forces our hand on that idea. In verse 11, he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. What has he just done with the sin of partiality? Yeah, put it on the same level as adultery and murder. And what thoughts or feelings do those things stir up in you? Partiality ought to stir up the same kind of thoughts. And so he says, to try to help us to, again, kind of level the playing field as relates to sin. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. What's the point? The point is, as he goes on to, as he's previously said in verse 9, or verse 10, whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point is guilty of all. So what law is James discussing here in this text? I kind of got ahead a little bit of my notes, but that's okay. Or what I intended to say. But what law is James discussing here when he talks about in verses 9 and 10 the law, and then verse 10 the whole law? Yeah, because of what he goes on to highlight in verse 11, the law of Moses, and so the people to whom he's writing, remember, James is one of the first books of the New Testament to be written, most likely. He's writing to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. He's writing to people who likely are Jewish Christians and who've come to Christ out of the background of knowing the law of Moses. What did the law of Moses teach you? Well, the law of Moses had taught them over and over again that when they were guilty in one point of the law, they were guilty in all points of the law. Now, what that then left them with, if they were living under the old law, was the need to continually offer sacrifices year after year. But what all of that pointed to was salvation ultimately in Jesus. So the principle, though, stands. Whatever law we find ourselves under, whether it's now the law of liberty or then the law of Moses, we can't pick and choose, right? Let's think about this as a principle in Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5. So, this isn't really what James is addressing, but Paul is addressing a different problem, addressing this idea that was prevalent in Galatia. Some false teachers had come and said, the gospel's good, but the gospel with the law of Moses would be better, and especially if you would, basically live out your Christianity as though you were Jews, that would be better. Had gotten them to, or had tried to get them to co-opt Jewish customs and practices as a matter of faith. So what does Paul say? Galatians chapter 5, verse 1, he says, "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with a yoke of bondage." Remember, the yoke of the law was a burden, as James himself said in Acts chapter 15, that neither the fathers nor they could bear. So this yoke of bondage is what it was to live under the old law. He says, "I say, though," in verse number 2, "Indeed, I, Paul, say to you that if you become circumcised, Christ will profit you nothing." Now, that doesn't undo the teaching of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that says the actual practice of circumcision is nothing, spiritually speaking. But what it's saying is that if you try to elevate circumcision to a matter of faith or any other thing external to the gospel, if you elevate that to the level of the gospel, you are not going to be profited by Christ. Why? Because in verse number 3, "I testify again to every man who becomes circumcised that he is a debtor to keep the whole law. You have become estranged from Christ. You attempt to be justified by the law. You have fallen from grace." You try to pick and choose, and God says no. In the case of the Galatian false teachers, they were trying to bring some things out of the law of Moses and bring them into the law of Christ. And Paul says, well, no, you can't pick and choose like that. You need to actually, if you're going to keep part of the old law, go back to all of the old law. And if you go back to all of the old law, where does that leave you? Christ is not in your life at all anymore. Because as much as the old law pointed to Jesus, now that we've arrived at Jesus, you can't go back to as Paul says in Galatians chapter 3, the schoolmaster or the tutor. You can't go back to the old law or the old way. Now, that principle then applies as relates to any aspect of following God. We can't pick and choose. Even if our temptation is not to pick and choose from the old law, if we're going to try to pick and choose from the new law, we can't. We've got to be responsible to all of it. And so what that ultimately then ties partiality with as a subject of the new law is with any other thing that's a subject of the new law. If you are going to be faithful in your church attendance, if you're going to be faithful in your kindness and other aspects of your life, so many things that the law of Christ touches on, but you're going to show partiality. You're going to judge people as James is describing here in James chapter 2. If you're going to do that, then you are guilty of all of the law and subject to judgment. See, partiality, to go on to verse 12, partiality is an act of judgment. And so what's the issue with acting like a judge? We aren't judges. We are those who will be judged. And so in verse 12, so speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. You learned from the old law that all sin, of course, separates you from God, and that you can't, just not do this and expect to get away with it. And so as those who are judged by the law of liberty, stop trying to be judges. Should Christians fear the judgment? This is kind of like you could imagine somebody reading that from a certain point of view and kind of quivering at this thought. But I want us to, speak and do as those judged by the law of liberty. Should Christians fear the judgment? What do you guys think about that? Some should. Elaborate.
That we can be sure in our salvation.
Yep.
And if we're working towards that end, and our lives are directed to be more Christ-like.
Yeah.
We should not fear the judgment, even though we recognize we are imperfect.
Yeah.
But those people who wear Christianity as a facade, as a weekend thing, they haven't come to know God yet.
Yeah.
They understand the gospel, but they don't know God yet. And those people should be.
Yeah. There is, we could think about, like, let me reiterate the point you've made, and then I'll make another point on top of that. There are some people who should be afraid of the judgment because they have effectively had a partial faith. Whether they've been partial in judgment or not, they've been picking and choosing and not being holistic in the way that they approach with their obedience to Christ. Those people do have fear. But I love that you pointed out that we can have confidence as we stand before God. The general epistles are a beautiful study, both in the practice of faith and in the confidence that it gives. I think about James and how practical what he says is, and then I think about John and 1 John chapter 2 and verse 3. We can know that we know him if we keep his commandments. There's no doubt about where we stand before God, and thus no fear of a certain kind. And so the point that I'll add to what you said is that while we should never be disrespectful of what's going to happen and of Jesus' position over us, and therefore we should always have a certain kind of fear, a certain kind of reverence. We don't need to be people who live in terror. And so to again borrow from another thing that John says, what does perfect love do? It casts out that kind of fear. So we don't have to stand fearful of where we are before God as we live in faith. But to live in faith is not to pick and choose. To live in faith is not to live with glaring omissions or contradictions to what you have been called to be and do. Partiality is a glaring contradiction to what you've been called to be and do. So I think that's the point that's being made. Any other thoughts about verse number 12?
Find ourselves in a position where we don't always, but sometimes we find ourselves in positions where we do have to judge.
Yeah.
We do have to make decisions. In my case, I did that for the last 10 years or so. I was in a position where I had to make decisions that affected people. And a lot of times, it's not fearing the judgment, but it's understanding that we're going to be judged by the same standards.
Yeah.
And that shapes the way that we make our decisions. It's not based on, whether we like that person or not. We have to understand that at some point we will be judged, and therefore we need to show the mercy and such that we would expect God to show for us.
Yeah, that's
decisions.
We're going to get to that thought in verse number 13, but we did talk about, this has been a discussion kind of spanning several weeks, but judgment is not, just to remind us, and then also to reiterate that point, judgment is not like a categorical no-no as Christians. Like sometimes it's presented that way. People, I don't know if you've seen pictures of this before I have, where people have illustrated the way people approach Matthew 7:1, Judge not lest you be judged, and then everything else is black after it. Like they've actually rubbed it out of their Bible, because people think that the real issue is expressing any kind of judgment. That's not the real issue. The real issue is a judgment that fails to take into consideration the fact that we're going to be judged, and a judgment that proceeds with a harsher standard being applied to others than the one that's applied to us. Jesus says that to elaborate on his point there, with what judgment you judge, it will be judged back to you effectively in Matthew 7:1 and following. So we're going to, if we apply a measuring stick to somebody else, Jesus says, if that's stricter than mine, then rest assured, I'm going to apply that same measuring stick to you, and you no doubt will not measure up to your own standards. So it's always safest to apply God's measuring stick to things. And then when we do that, and apply it to ourselves, then we can be helpful in the way that Jesus envisions. Because Jesus talks about how, at the end of the day, two people have things in their eyes. We want to see clearly before so we can help the other person with a thing in their eye. Well, we've got to apply the standard of judgment to ourselves first. Saw a couple of hands go up. So one over here.
That properly trained conscience constantly self-evaluates our heart, and it will either give us confidence before God, or it's going to make us have an uneasy feeling about how we're doing.
Yeah. So a properly trained conscience. Conscience is not a it's not the arbiter of faith, the final arbiter of faith, I should say. It's a tool that God has given us, and it's think of it like an umpire that operates based upon the rules it's been taught. If the spiritual game is basketball, don't give your conscience the rules of baseball. You have to apply God's rule book to your conscience and allow that to shape the way that you feel. And there may be some times where that takes some time to co-opt, but once your conscience has been shaped by the Word of God, you stand confident before Him as you walk faithfully in Him. Let's see a hand back here somewhere. Yeah, there was.
1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul writes in verse 12, "For what have I to do with judging them that are without? Do not you judge them that are within."
Yeah.
So this is, as you say, we don't cast out all judging.
Yeah.
But James is saying, when you do it, it better not be with partiality.
Absolutely.
And sometimes we see that where people, if it's a family member, treat them different than someone else, or someone I'm closer to, they get a different treatment.
Yeah. Just because James might not be describing the kind of partiality that you are tempted by, don't miss the point. Any kind of partiality is sinful, and we tend to naturally show a certain kind of partiality towards those who are close to us, family members, friends. Proverbs talks about even showing partiality towards those we hear first in a problem. Like the first person who comes to us is the person that we so often believe, whereas again, we want to try to think about things as God would have us to do that, and then that would have us, judging not according to appearances, but judging righteous judgment, taking in all the information and then using the gospel as our measuring stick, as we've talked about.
Like you said, kind of choosing the what we think is the best and then imposing that on others. What happens in our society often is sometimes a ranking of good things as well, like, oh, this person, I respect them because they have this one quality which I think is the quality that is important, and then, if somebody else doesn't exhibit that, even if they have other qualities, they're not as respectable because they have these flaws that this person doesn't have. And I think realizing that, there's different talents and personalities in the body, no matter what we value.
Yeah. To truly value things as God values them is to see the beauty and uniqueness, and to see that, there's different roles in the body, there's different things that people are good or bad at, and we shouldn't give people a pass because they have a certain set of things that we value. That's what Chantel was saying. So we'll start off our conversation next time. I think that bell did ring, with Romans chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, and what it teaches us about the importance of living as those judged rather than of living with a judgmental mindset. There is, like I said, sometimes judgments have to be made, but then there's also a great danger in sort of sitting in that position of a judge. And I think that will be elaborated with a little bit of discussion for Romans 2. So we'll pick up with that, Lord willing, next time. Let's close out with a word of prayer.